Tapioca.
Well, it's a little bit after the hour, and as we begin to get together, we'll let the scrolling announcements finish out on this circuit. But I welcome everyone. The Lord be with you, and so glad that you could join in worship today. Yes, a quick reminder, we'll have a presentation following the worship service, and hope that you'll remain for that. And all right, I think we're ready to start then. Well, may we begin our worship service with our morning prelude. May we hear these words calling us into worship, using words from the great hymn, Come Thou Almighty King. Come Thou Almighty King, Help us thy name to sing. Help us to praise. Father, all glorious, o'er all victorious, come and reign over us, Ancient of Days. Our opening hymn for this morning is In the Bulb There Is a Flower. I think Will is bringing up the screen share for the hymn.
I am. It's taking a little bit. Give me a second.
That's all right.
Church.
As we come together, or as Will is bringing up the hymn, again, a word of welcome to all who are joining together this morning. It's so great to see you and to see some guests today and some folks we haven't seen in a while on Zoom worship. So it's great to welcome you all today.
She came up here and ate her breakfast. She's good. She's probably back on her.
And a technical word for folk, don't forget that if you're not saying anything in the worship service, whether it's a prayer or something, you can be heard. So do mute yourself. And here we go. We got the hymn coming up. I want to invite all of our young disciples to jump up to the screen, and I'm going to attempt to do a children's sermon today. I'm not sure I'm going to be doing very well today. How many of you, raise your hands, and all of our not so young adults can raise their hands as well. How many of you have pet dogs? So many of you have pet dogs, don't you? I know that some of us have had to let some of our pet dogs go over the Rainbow Bridge, and we grieve for them. But many of us have pet dogs, and I'm curious to know, out of those of us who have pet dogs, how many of those dogs are indoors at least some of the time? Raise your hands. Are they indoors some of the time? Yeah, we had a pet dog that was indoor all of the time, just about, except to go outside to use the bathroom. And so how many of you, raise your hands on this one, how many of you might feed your pet dog from the dinner table? Be honest, be honest. Might feed, now, yeah, you might feed them some of the good stuff, or maybe you're going to feed them Brussels sprouts or green beans, right? Or broccoli that you don't want to eat. But you might feed them from the table. Well, today we have a story where a woman wants to be healed by Jesus. And unbelievably, the story says that Jesus wasn't willing to heal her. He didn't want to have anything to do with her. And he says, you know what? I don't think I have to do that for you. And the woman says, well, you know what? Even dogs get crumbs from the table. And, her point in that whole idea was that, sometimes it's a good thing when even folks that aren't expected to get help when they need it, even sometimes they get a little bit of help. Sometimes we might let our dogs have a few crumbs from the table because they might be a little hungry. And so we want to feed them. And so when this woman was asking for this help from Jesus, she said, sometimes, a dog's going to get crumbs from the table, then I definitely want crumbs from the table as well. I think that's just as important. And so we want to remember that all people who need help, who, regardless of who they are, deserve to have that help when they need it. And that's the story I wanted to share today a little bit. And why don't we have a word of prayer? Let's pray. God, thank you for the gift of your Son, Jesus Christ, who came to help the world and to help all people. But even Jesus sometimes had to be reminded that that includes everyone, even people that we're not so sure need help. Help us to know all those who are in need, oh God, and give us the power to help them. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Our scripture for today comes from the book of Matthew, chapter 15, verses 21 through 28. Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Diane, for that reading from Matthew's Gospel. This story is a very provocative story to me. I remember maybe it was 6 years ago, I preached not on this particular text, but I did preach on the Gospel of Mark's version of the same story. And so the woman was known as a Syrophoenician woman coming to Jesus for help and being refused. And the woman engages in debate with Jesus and essentially changes his mind. And that's what's really so provocative about this story to me, is that we see an instance in the Gospels where we can really argue, I think, and stay with me here, we can really argue that Jesus was wrong. That Jesus, Jesus showed a little bit perhaps of his humanity. Jesus showed perhaps a bit of his imperfection. Here is someone we always view and understand and of course worship as perfect. And yet we see something that appears to be imperfect about Jesus in this story. You could almost say that Jesus, in showing his full humanity in this story, shows us that as a human, even he, rabbi, Lord, healer, prophet, that even he gets caught up in the culture of his own particular culture in his day in time. This is that kind of a story where we read about Jesus entering into a debate, and rather than winning the debate, Jesus would appear to be on the side of the debate where it is he who is changing his mind after the woman convinces him of the need and the helpfulness of her daughter receiving the healing that she wished for her daughter to have. Remember that this is a woman, or this is a person who is not Jewish, a Canaanite woman coming out of that region, and she simply wants what any parent would want for their child, what any mother would want for her daughter. She wishes for mercy. The daughter is being tormented by a demon. And so like any mom, any parent, she wishes for her to have mercy shown upon her, that the demon would be taken out of her, exorcised, that the demon would be removed from her. And yet at that request, which is a request that is no different than any other request that Jesus has received from people in his travels, he does not answer her at all. It's like she's being avoided altogether. Even, and we get the sense that as the disciples are talking to Jesus, we get the sense that she keeps on asking, have mercy on me, O Lord. Have mercy on me, son of David. And she recognizes who Jesus is as the Messiah by calling him. She recognizes that lineage to the king, to the son of David, that he himself, Jesus, may be that King of Kings, that promised one who was come to rescue and to come to save Israel and the world. But she keeps on asking, have mercy, have mercy. And the disciples even are growing tired of this woman's request, and they say to Jesus, they urge him, it says in the text, in the New Revised Standard Version, they urged him saying, send her away. Get rid of her. Say something to her, Jesus, because she keeps shouting after us. Say something that will get her out of here so that she can stop bothering us. Almost like she is persisting She is persisting in her needs for her daughter, to seek that relief for her daughters, even to the point that it bothers the disciples, but she doesn't care. She is only there to get that mercy that her daughter needs. She persists. Jesus answers his disciples. He says, I'm only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Jesus is expressing what he believes is his clear mission to minister to the nation Israel. That's certainly a perspective that Matthew would promote, because Matthew was written to really convince the people of Israel that Jesus came as the Messiah, as the one who would deliver Israel. Jesus suggests or proclaims that he's really there for the house of Israel, but still she persists. And so she comes and she kneels before him, saying, Lord, Lord, she says, help me. Finally, he engages her. He engages her by saying, you know what? It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. Now, there's a little bit of what I guess is cultural or historical context here that I think is interesting, that I didn't realize that may have been true. What some of my research revealed was that Jewish culture, at least Jewish culture in that day and time, really did not regard pets, dogs, as pets in the same way that the Greeks did, or those who were Gentiles. And so this sort of imagery of comparing, having this comparison of the dogs, was suggesting that, the children of Israel, the house of Israel, is far more superior than really any other group that is out there. It's almost like it's a comparison, Jesus is saying, between children and dogs in the household. It's a fairly, well, not fairly, it's a pretty insulting comparison to make, that other groups, the Gentiles, Canaanites, Syrophoenicians, are of no comparison culturally to the people of Israel, to the house of Israel. Jesus is clear about this, but still the woman persists and engages Jesus in this debate, in that conversation, by saying, yes, Lord, I'll give you that. I'll give you that, Lord. But even the dogs get to eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Even the dogs can get crumbs. That which is left over, they can still get. The woman's persistence has paid off. Jesus answers her by saying, woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish. And her daughter was healed instantly. The woman's persistence, the woman's engagement with Jesus in that conversation, it really in that debate over that metaphor, if you will, she's able to be seen as faithful by Jesus. And in that moment, that faithfulness is what grants her daughter that healing. Jesus doesn't even have to see the daughter or to touch the daughter to be able to provide that healing. He simply recognizes the faith of that daughter's mother and says, what you wish for will be done. And she is healed. This is a story to me where Jesus is kind of wrong. where someone is able to engage him in that conversation and say, wait a minute. What I think is provocative about the story too is that we do see an instance where perhaps Jesus really is caught up in the cultural bias of his day and time. He could only see the value of the house of Israel, even to the point that he says that anything else, any other group, are like dogs, not worthy to be even in the house, not even worthy to be at the table. And the woman even acknowledges that, surprisingly, but says, wait a minute, anyone should be able to receive even a little bit of that grace. Anyone should be able to receive those crumbs from the table. If we don't think that this story has implications for today, then I wonder. I remember when I preached on the Mark version of this story some years ago. I guess it was probably 2014 when I preached it. I was at another church, and the Black Lives Matter movement had just started. Had not been very long ago. I think the Black Lives Matter movement started in perhaps 2013. Started by all women, I believe, women of color. And I remember in that sermon, the sermon title I remember was, "Does a Syrophoenician Life Matter?" And I made the same argument that I'm making today in interpreting the scripture, that Jesus was, he was caught up in his own cultural bias. Whether or not we can believe that, I think that's really where the text is pointing us, is that can happen, that even Jesus, even as we see him in his humanity, I think the fact that he is human says that, yeah, even someone as perfect as Jesus, he is still human and still can be caught up even in his own biases of his own time. Well, if Jesus can be caught up in his own cultural bias, should we be surprised that we are too? We all are caught up in some way or another with some form of implicit bias in our lives. And what we are being confronted with today, because of a movement that was started by women who persisted, just like the Canaanite woman persisted, we are being reminded that everyone should be able to come to the table. And really, that's as God intended for life to be, that everyone has the opportunity, the ability to come to the table, to come to the table together, and to not necessarily receive the crumbs that fall off the table, but to have a full place at the table, even able to share in the grace that God has given to the world. The lesson of the woman who engaged in that debate with Jesus and won the debate, I would say, is that we are called to share our crumbs. We are called to bring folks to our table. We are called to persist that all are able to come to the table, to insist that all are to come to the table and to have that equal place. Jesus recognized the faith of the woman in her persistence to engage him and to confront him in his own particular bias in that day and time. And in doing so, he recognizes her faith and grants her wish for her daughter, healing. When we welcome, when we insist that all may be welcome and are welcome to the table, then I believe that we will know healing too. That the wish that we want for healing for the world will and can take place when we insist that everyone is welcome to the table with full and equal measure. May we work for that day. May we pray for that day. May we find ways in which we can work for that day. Let us pray. Oh God, we thank you for the Canaanite woman, also known as the Syrophoenician woman in Mark's gospel, someone who confronted Jesus and his refusal to recognize her, still persisting and claiming a place at the table. Help us, O Lord, to recognize that all are granted access to your table of grace, to the table of equality. O Lord, help us to not only welcome them to the table, but to help others to welcome them too. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Well, we come now to a time where we want to share in our prayer concerns, and let's see, I'm going to see if I can bring hymn for this morning. It's such a wonderful hymn, Amazing Grace. And now as you go out into the world, be persistent. Be persistent like the Canaanite woman was persistent and insisting that all are welcome to the table. Fight for that belief, fight for that right that all are welcome. All are welcome to not only God's table, but to the table of life itself. And now as you go out into the world, do not fear. For love, God's love, casts out fear. Go in peace. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. So glad that everyone could be here today. And yeah, that's just an issue with technology. Will get some of that choppiness and bad connection sometimes, and sometimes it has to do with the weather, and sometimes not. So no worries there. We do the best to remain. Like to remain. I'll be sharing a presentation, and I think we'll do that first, and then if we want to have a time of fellowship and conversation following that, we can. My presentation part, I hope, will not take more than maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15 at the most. It's just a few slides that I'm going to share. And so I'm going to try to do the best that I can at the technology end of this, and begin to bring up my screen to share. So if y'all are okay, we'll get started. Anyone who is a guest today, you're welcome to remain and learn about what we're going through as a community of faith, a new worshiping community in the Presbyterian Church USA, and our process right now. So love for you to learn about that, and even in some way be a part of that journey with us if you wish. Okay. So let me bring up my screen share. And just to make sure, I see a few things off to my side. Are y'all seeing? Yeah, I get a nod from Lane that she's seeing that. So good. Now I'm going to go to the beginning of the slide. Here we are. So hopefully you're going to see a sailboat there, and the Kirk of Holly Springs, the journey to becoming a chartered congregation. That should be up there on your screen. And just a quick word about the metaphor, that picture there of a sailboat. Sailboat Church is a book that was written by Joan Gray, who is a former moderator of our denomination, and she has been, I believe, an executive presbyter and has taught at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. I think has really used this phrase of a sailboat church before, and really as a way to encourage churches to live as fully as possible into their mission and into the idea of change. All churches in all stages of their lives and of their development are going to go through change. And it does feel like a boat that's leaving the safety of its own harbor and going out into the open sea a bit and getting under sail. I imagine, Dave, yeah, it's kind of like going up in a plane. At some point, you just have to trust that it's going to work. And so we're like, this process that we're going through is kind of like setting sail. But I want to kind of be very clear on this image that while we're setting sail, and this image suggests that we're on our own, we're by ourselves, I want you to imagine that sort of behind this boat are two other sailboats that are pretty big. And one sailboat is called New Hope Presbytery, and the other sailboat is called the Kirk of Kildare. And while they are not doing the sailing for us, they are kind of close by to provide us the help that we might need. And that's an image I want you to keep in mind as we think about a journey of a sailboat. We're being allowed to, or have the opportunity to set sail on our own, under our own sail, but we are not being set adrift by ourselves. There's not that sense of aloneness there that many churches feel like they're facing. So with that metaphor in mind, I think it's helpful to speak to what exactly does it mean when we say charter, because we've heard that, you probably have heard that word before, sort of in the general sense of like the charter of a country or the charter of a state. That might be something you've heard, and really all a charter is an official establishing document that gives, in the case of churches, gives denominational permission to exist, essentially, and provides a sort of connected support and legitimacy of a new congregation. So it's all chartering is, or a charter is an official document. That's in the general sense when we talk about charter. So when we talk about a chartering process, we're talking about that process to get that official recognition, or to have those documents that officially recognize us as a congregation. And so in the Presbyterian Church USA, the group that worships together can become a congregation, can only become a congregation if they file that charter or provide that application. And so when it asks or petitions, that's another word, petition, apply, ask, request, all of those are sort of synonyms for what it means to try and get that charter. Only the Presbyterian Church, through the local presbytery, can grant that charter. And only then does that group become a congregation. And so it's important to note, and I think many of us already know this, but we are not a congregation. KOHS, we might think of ourselves as a church in the sort of general sense of church, but institutionally speaking, we're a ministry team. We're a ministry team of the Kirk of Kildare, and so we're not a congregation. We have some autonomy. We're allowed to make some decisions on our own, but in some cases we have to get permission for certain decisions. And that's just what it means to be a part of a larger church, a larger congregation, the Kirk of Kildare, and so we're a ministry team of the Kirk. Many of us know that. Just want to make sure we're all on board with that, though. And so that's sort of what a charter is. So I'm going to take a quick stop and say, are there any questions? And I don't have my full screen in front of me. I'm going to see if I can get back to gallery view. But speak up if you have a question. No, it's not letting me really get to the full gallery. Anybody have a question they want to speak up and ask? Okay, I'm not hearing one or seeing anything in the text or in the chat room. So, Will, you kind of be on the lookout for that too, if you can. All right, go to my next slide. So, I guess the question might be is, well, why charter? Why seek to charter? Or why become a congregation? In the end, only that group that has that question posed to them, only they can answer the question, why become a congregation? There are reasons why many groups become a congregation when they first form. Sometimes it's just simply because that's what they always wanted to do. That was the intent from the very beginning. And so that's the pathway that they've taken. In other cases, it's a matter of discovering a desire and a need for more autonomy. And so, getting that autonomy means becoming a standalone congregation. Sometimes a partner church wants that. That's their intention in having been a part of the startup of that group. In the Presbyterian Church, sometimes it's the presbytery that wants it. That the reason they will have started that new community is that they at some point wanted a new congregation. And in some cases, people feel that it can encourage growth. That if you set up and become a chartered congregation, it would encourage growth. But a reflection question that I think for all of us, and I think this is probably something that we've all been kind of wondering through the years, and for anyone that's new to this process that we're in, why do you think KOHS should become a congregation? So I want you to just think about that, and if you want to speak up right now and share why you think KOHS should become a congregation, please feel free to do so. Or we'll chat afterwards too. There'll be a time for questions and comments. At least I hope there will be. I will move us through the slides. So are there some steps to becoming a congregation? And the answer to that is yes. There are steps that we can take to becoming a congregation. In our particular case, this is what it would look like, or generally what it would look like. And first of all, it's a matter of working together. And in our case, we're working together with the Presbytery through its Church Development and Evangelism Committee, as well as alongside the Kirk of Kildare. And we're working together to determine a timeline for when KOHS will be or can be a congregation. That actually is already happening. We've already begun that process. We have a task force of folk from our community and the Big Kirk who have been meeting for a while, not at a high frequency, but we have been meeting and doing some work and have gotten that process started. But according to the Presbyterian Book of Order, there are some very specific steps in organizing a congregation. And that very first step is that the Presbytery will receive an application or a petition. Remember, those are similar words. They will receive an application or a petition for members to form a church or a congregation from the persons who wish to make up the membership of that congregation. And these persons sign an organizing covenant. That's what it's called specifically in the Book of Order, an organizing covenant. It's also known as an organizing document. And it's very specific wording in order to apply to the Presbytery for that. But it is that group of people who wish to form that congregation. So in other words, presbyteries don't, they don't, a committee of presbytery doesn't sign a petition to form that congregation. A session doesn't sign a petition to organize a group of people to be a congregation. Only those people who will form that congregation can sign that application and that petition. I want to make sure that's clear to folk, is that there will be a point in time where if KOHS does want to petition the Presbytery, you'll be signing your name to that application. If that's, if you decide that's what you want to do. So that's what it means to sign or to form an organizing covenant. Now, quickly, I want to show you what an organizing covenant is. I'm not sure if you can see it, all of the words here, because of how the gallery view is. I can't see all of my words. I'm going to see if I can move my my little thing. Yeah, there we go. So an organizing covenant is a very specific document or wording, and it's right there on your screen, and you can find the wording in the Book of Order. It basically says, "We, the undersigned, in response to the grace of God, desire to be constituted and organized as a congregation of the Presbyterian Church USA, to be known as," and then you insert your name, "and we promise and covenant to live together in unity and to work together in ministry as disciples of Jesus Christ, bound to him and to one another, as a part of the body of Christ in this place, according to the principles of the Presbyterian of this book, of this Constitution, and of the Presbyterian Church USA. I think I just sort of summarized the words there on that one. But an organizing covenant is a very specific request to presbytery, and underneath that organizing covenant, those who wish to form that congregation sign their names. And if I probably could be corrected on this, but I'm pretty sure I'm right on this. That means that if there's a minister, a person like me, that's a part of that community at that time, I don't sign it. I'm not a member of that congregation. But folks like Dave and Lane Yao, or Bruce, or I'm seeing people on my screen here, Mary Bethel or Will McGuire, all of you would be able to sign that to form that congregation. Any questions at this point?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
What benefits and responsibilities does it entail?
So that comes under the why. Why become a congregation, I think. And I'll tell you what, I'm going to try to answer that and let others answer that too after I finish with the slides. How does that sound? Would that be okay?
Yep.
Okay. So here are some other steps to becoming a congregation, and these come out of that section of the Book of Order that talks about organizing. So when the presbytery approves the congregation as organized, then that congregation goes about the work of electing its officers. That always means electing a session. It sometimes means also electing a board of deacons. Those are two different governing bodies. In a congregation, a session is the elders, so that's sort of like our leadership team. All congregations in the Presbyterian Church USA have a session. The deacons is a slightly different office for the Presbyterian Church USA. It's mostly grounded in pastoral care. It has other traditional work responsibilities that have occurred in the life and in the history of the Presbyterian Church. But deacons are not required officers per se in a local congregation. They can be more optional. So the congregation elects its officers, and actually in a new congregation, the presbytery is really responsible for taking the lead on training, ordaining, and installing those new officers. Now, this is under sort of the typical Book of Order kind of practice. Other organizational matters take place with the close help of a presbytery. Bylaws are written and approved. Incorporation papers are filed. The new church is organized for mission and ministry. All of the pieces that it takes to run a church are attended to with the help of presbytery. That is the intention from the Book of Order, that a presbytery helps that congregation to get itself up and running. So again, a congregation is not set adrift to do that work by itself. It typically is going to have the help of its presbytery in some form or fashion. In the case of New Hope Presbytery, and I will lean on Mary Bethel, who is a member of the Church Development Evangelism Committee of Presbytery, but in the case of New Hope Presbytery, a lot of these organizational matters actually get done before the group applies to become a chartered congregation. Is that something that tends to be true in our presbytery, Mary? You're on mute. Mary Mary's on.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, I think that's exactly right. Usually by the time you get to the point of doing all the paperwork stuff, you've got a lot of this background stuff already taken care of.
Thank you, Mary. So a lot of us have had questions about, yeah, okay, it's fine, all fine and well to get chartered. Presbytery will help us file incorporation papers with the state of North Carolina. That's good stuff. But what about all the other detail work? What's going to happen there? Well, a lot of those details we know are handled by the Kirk of Kildare. The Sunday bulletin, when we were printing it out, was done by the office. Our liability insurance covered by the Kirk of Kildare. Payroll checks written by the Kirk of Kildare. Bills paid by the Kirk of Kildare. A lot of administrative and financial issues, and probably I would say nearly all, that's probably exclusively the things that the Kirk of Kildare pretty much does for us is admin and finance. We want to figure out how does the Kirk make the transition from them overseeing those items to KOHS overseeing those items. That's probably the biggest question we have, other than the why question that Bruce has raised, I think, that we have about the chartering process. Well, the transition is a process. And part of that process means that, first of all, it's going to be helpful for us to form a team that, one, engages in that process, a sort of administration, and finance team. And we actually are in the process of starting to form that team. The other part of that process is for that team to meet with the appropriate people at the Kirk, staff and other team leaders, like their personnel, their finance people, maybe their stewardship team, a lot of different teams, as well as the appropriate staff, like Jody or Ellen Chambers, who is their their office financial officer. All of these are folks that we will need to meet with to talk about what kind of timeline, what kinds of things will get turned over to us, how they will be turned over to us, and when. So that's something that we will work together with the Kirk on to see what that looks like. And we'll have a mutual agreement to that timeline, and then we'll implement that timeline, I would say with benchmarks, like what does it look like for us to take this on? And then I think at least on my screen, I'm blocking the bottom part. So I'm gonna try to move it here again. The Kirk leadership in this process, and I'll just say that when I say leadership, I mean Jody. That's where I'm hearing it from most prominently. But Jody has affirmed that this process can and will be, he hopes, a gradual process. In other words, no one's really vying to immediately turn everything over to us. There's a desire for us to be really, to set things up for success and for a smooth transition. And so I think there's an agreement and an understanding that this will be a gradual process of how these things turn over. I don't know what that looks like right now. I don't think anybody really knows what that looks like right now, but we do know that it's a conversation that we'll be having, a process that we'll engage in. And it's not something that will just take place overnight. It's not like a switch will be flipped and it'll happen. It'll be a process in which we engage. And then finally, yeah. Chartering is our opportunity to become a sailboat church, but I want to go back and I'm going to get off screen share here so I can see more folk. I want to go back to Bruce's question of, well, why? What's the benefit of that? You know what? I'm not going to speak to that myself. I want to see if any of our folk wish to speak to that themselves, and happy to hear from them if they see any advantage or benefit to it.
That also included a responsibility.
I mean, what are the responsibilities if we're on our own?
Yeah, benefits and responsibilities. What are the benefits and what are the responsibilities
Yeah.
of chartership?
Any of our folk that have discussed this before? Go ahead, Mary.
I'll just say a few words. I think, back, 5, 6, 7 years ago, ever how many years ago it was that we all started this process, I think there was a kind of a desire to have an independent Presbyterian church in the Holly Springs area. And, we were lucky enough that the Kirk of Holly Springs agreed to shepherd us during this process and to make, as you said, as a ministry or mission team of the Kirk. But I think there was a desire to be independent, to basically have our own autonomy in doing things back when we started. And I think, I've heard a lot of people express that same thoughts at this point. I mean, it is a big step for us because, as a smaller, even though I'll call us a congregation, even though we aren't really a congregation, it's a smaller group. Doing just those administrative type things is a big chore, is going to be a big undertaking. And the fact that the Kirk has agreed to hold our hand, to be with us in partnership as we go through this process, and not say, come tomorrow, you're on your own, I think is a great comfort to us in this journey that we've undertaken. I think that there are many things that we capably could do very well right now ourselves, and are doing, quite frankly, many of them. But there are other things that we would have to analyze our expertise in doing it. We would have to look at what type of additional resources we might need in order to carry things out too. So, I mean, we have been very lucky with the way support we've gotten from the Kirk, that most of our resources have been devoted to paying a pastor and to our program and our mission type activities, our youth programs, things of that nature. So there might be some added cost to us of things that we would have to do to administratively take on responsibilities for things. But it also, I think, when it comes to the types of events and activities we can do to generate additional resources and things for our congregation, I think being, on our own provides a lot of opportunities to do that. So that's just a few thoughts I had from kind of being here from day one with it.
So I guess big question there. So is the big difference as a non-chartered church, as a non-independent church, we cannot do or select our own programs without getting them approved by the session or diaconate at Kirk? Is that the big difference?
No, I think the Kirk and those, Dave, you've been a session liaison, and Mary's current session liaison, that the Kirk grants autonomy as far as programmatic items.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, it's the ministry team concept that the big Kirk is under. What it does is what most churches you're used to is you see a committee, and to be able to do something or spend money on the committee, you have to go to the session and request permission, Mother May I, and all of that. Well, what the Kirk has done is with ministry teams, if they've kind of handed that down to the ministry team and said, hey, you got this, run with it. You don't have to come see us and say, Mother May I, move out with it. And that's all of their ministry teams. So being a ministry team underneath the Kirk of Kildare, we have the same level of autonomy. And where it changes is when we want to do something, for example, like I'll just say, we were looking for Jonathan. Well, we don't have the authority as a ministry team to hire personnel. That is the big Kirk, their personnel committee, which is the personnel ministry team, and the session has the approval for that one. That's one of the things where you have to go to session.
Gotcha.
that's a good sample, Dave, of that. Also, I think when it comes down to vision issues and strategic issues, we are able to develop our own mission statement, but we did have to take it to the Kirk for approval because of being that ministry team. There was still that sort of, well, we don't want to just go out and be this in the world when, you know, when that might not be consistent with who the Kirk was wanting us to be.
Gotcha.
Not that we're going to stray that far away. I mean, you can look at a Presbyterian church USA today and they're all fairly similar, but I think you get my point in terms of strategic issues.
Gotcha. So for
And then the whole calling of the minister thing is,
so
and
as
a
a
few other
committee,
items, personnel items as well.
gotcha. So as a ministry team, for example, we could purchase the little stuff and that belongs to a ministry team, such as some of the things we have in the church. But we
Yeah.
want to be able to make a big decision like purchasing a building or something like that, or leasing a new place without doing a separate.
Yeah, Will, exactly. So for example, we're gonna purchase a bunch of things for the annual October holiday, spring holiday fling, fall fest, whatever, to hand out. We have the authority to do that, but we don't have the authority to enter into a rental agreement with the United Church of Christ for the building. That is done with and by the big Kirk.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
Okay.
we do all the work on it, and then we make a recommendation to the Kirk that they approve it. And the nice thing about, Jonathan's on staff at the Kirk, and then as Jonathan said, we have a staff liaison. We have a member of the Kirk session is from our congregation, and at every session meeting we do a report briefly of kind of key things that the session needs to go on. And sometimes if there's something that we think needs to have session approval, we will present that to them. So there's that real line of communication there that, we make sure that we honor.
Gotcha. So I guess the biggest question I have is not having those bigger ticket items, those bigger lines of authority with the relationship we have, is becoming a chartered member, does it help us accelerate ministry quicker in everybody's opinion, or does it matter from carrying out, what we need to do as a church of Jesus Christ? Or is it a Christian church?
If what I'm hearing is correct, and you correct me if I'm wrong, is the benefit is more autonomy. The responsibility is you might need more resources. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, but I think in time, even if we stayed under the Kirk umbrella in an institutional sense, we would still be expected to come up with our own. I mean, we're expected to come up with our own resources now for the most part, but I think in time they'll expect us to keep coming up with them even more so.
Yeah, I think Jonathan mentioned that one of the things that we rely heavily on them for is the financial support, the writing the bills, keeping the books, things like that. That's was going to be something that is going to, once we assume that responsibility, that will be either an added expense or somebody in the congregation taking on those duties to do that type of thing, which, we pretty much relied on them to do that type of thing.
That's a good call out. So I guess my question with regard to this was, does it make sense even as we evolve? It sounds like one path is we can take it all on ourselves. The second path is, it sounds like the relationship is really good. We can still accelerate quickly as a congregation, and even perhaps just pay the Kirk to take on some of those things as we evolve more and more and more until such time that we need the autonomy. I'm not sure which path is a better path. Is that essentially what we're saying?
Well,
Yeah,
I tell you, Will, that's exactly the thing you just said was what we looked at when we were first starting and talking to the Kirk and talking to Ted and about which way we want to go. And what Jonathan kind of laid out in the path, and what I think Mary kind of relayed, is we were looking at, this may work, but we've got to take a step process, and at any point along the process, something may change. And I think that's the thing that we're looking at, is by moving towards a separate congregation. At any point along that path, if all of a sudden that goal may not be as reachable, we still have the safety net of the Kirk and the Presbytery, where we could continue to operate them as a ministry team. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it sure does. I mean, what I hear you saying is essentially that Kirk's can be nice to us, let us operate as independently as possible. We're equitable in how we make sure we compensate the Kirk as we go along that path for stuff we should be taking on anyway. And then at such point that it becomes more effective to be an independent church to carry out the mission of the church, then Kirk says, great, go do it. But
that's pretty much it. And the thing that when we were looking at this, and Mary, jump in and tell me to shut up anytime, but as we were looking at this, we were moving towards.
Whoops.
Wow.
They fell off.
I'm sure he'll be back.
Whoa, we really did shut him up.
I was good. I was like right in the middle of it. I was waiting.
I'm sure he's going to try to get back on, but
so let me jump in for a little bit and maybe
Go ahead,
track and try to do this quickly, because I actually have a question myself about our timeline. Okay, because we started meeting in people's homes way back when, what Mary was referring to back in 2012. I think Dave's coming back, but at some point we said, you know what, we're going to have a presence. We joined, a lot of us went ahead and joined the Kirk of Kildare, became members, but somewhere in there was a discussion about starting a new worship in Holly Springs. When we were meeting in the homes, we were figuring out where we're going to go, and a lot of people, there are some that did not come over. They joined other churches, other presbyteries, or even other churches. But a lot of us, those that you see, did join the big Kirk. But somewhere in there was deciding about, let's do a presence in Holly Springs. So that was decided, that's where we go. And our first place that we worshiped was the lodge, the Masonic Lodge. And at that time, we were already part under their umbrella, if you want to call it that, of the Kirk of Kildare. Because then actually we'd have ministers that come out and that would come out and preach for us, etc. Before we had somebody, Jonathan, for example. And Dave, you're back, so you can jump in and take over where you were going before.
Before my battery died. It's not everybody can say, yeah, I was in church, but my battery died. All right. But no, I'm trying to remember exactly where I was in my soliloquy, but the overarching thing is the fact that we're able to do the things that we need to do and pay our way forward and cover our own costs. It's all the intangibles that you typically don't see in a church, such as the paying for a secretary, paying for a bookkeeper, paying for the insurance. We're a rider on the Big Kirk's insurance, where we get to use all the paper for printing bulletins and flyers and all that. That's all done and paid for by the Kirk. Now, one of the things that they're doing for us is they're keeping track of everything dollar-wise that they do for us. And that's for a twofold reason. One, not because they're trying to count pennies on us and be all Scottish, but it's because when we do make that transition, we have a track record of how much it's costing, just the normal operations. Because they can tell, we can see what it's going to cost for insurance, for a bookkeeper and all of that, but all the other things that we're using, and it helps them keep track of what we're contributing and what they have outflow for our support. Okay, that was it.
Thinking of it as a business, is the congregational growth growing enough to support something like this? Are we getting new members to be able to support additional costs?
Well, the COVID has definitely caused a pause to what's going on. I mean, and we'll see what happens with that. But we were on track to do exactly what we're doing. We watch those numbers, okay? We track number of people that are attending every week. We also track if there are new people coming in, we contact them again afterwards to let them know, hey, thank you for coming, etc. So we know if there are new members every week. But to be straightforward with you and honest, it's been sort of stagnant because, and we have had members that have not attended, that are members of the church, but they're not attending at the moment. But we still get, if they've got some sort of a weekly or monthly giving, that is continuing. So they're still members, active members of the church from that standpoint. So the answer is sort of like, can't tell you. I mean, until this COVID goes away, I think I can say that we wouldn't be buying a new place or whatever. We might rent another place, but buying our own facility is probably way in the future at this juncture.
Let me speak to that too, and to Bruce's that particular question on the finance or management part of it. By kind of recounting a little bit of history of how new churches used to be started in the Presbyterian Church USA. It used to be that new churches would be heavily funded on the front end by their presbyteries to make sure they had a chance. But that was also an era in which people easily made choices to come on to church. And so you were seeing large numbers of people able to create that financial base. Now the model is a little bit different. You find more partnerships with large congregations because these communities that are starting up, they are finding out that they need to meet and join in much more creative ways than the old brick and mortar way of, here's our shingle that we're hanging out, come and see us. It's not necessarily works that way like it did in the past. Not to say that it can't, but it just, the tendency that what we notice, what tends to be true in new worshiping communities is that they are very, very experimental, creative, and do church in very different ways, even different than what we do, because we're a very kind of old-fashioned, if you will, kind of church development. So that actually makes us sort of an unusual or more unique in this day and age. But that's the older model, was a lot of heavy funding. Part of it too is that the Presbyterian Church just doesn't have the kind of money that it used to be able to do that. I mean, used to that they would buy land and build a building that would be the permanent church home for a new church development, and they would be on their way and get those members. Nowadays, you're renting space, you're creating unique partnerships. So the money's not there. Go ahead, Mary.
I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. So right now we have an arrangement with the Presbytery where they're giving us like safety net funding. So, we develop a budget of what we think it takes us to operate during the year, and they make sure that we have adequate funding to meet those needs. However, that funding is not going to go on forever. So it's back to the thing of that we're going to have to look at doing outreach and doing all sorts of things in order to grow our resources, in order to be able to sustain everything we're doing at the point the Presbytery does decide that we're no longer a new church development. I will say there's an expectation, I believe, from the Presbytery that we will become a freestanding independent congregation. And I think that when we first entered into this relationship with the Kirk of Kildare, they certainly embraced the idea of a satellite congregation, but I don't believe there was any understanding at that point that we would continue to be a satellite forever, or a ministry team forever, that we would at some point become an independent freestanding congregation on our own.
Yeah, well, I applaud everybody here that's done a ton of work on the administrative side. I know that's a ton of work. I also think it's really cool that we've got a relationship where it allows us to move quickly no matter what the scenario. So, I mean, me personally, I vote staying the way we are right now, if there is a vote. is probably the most effective way. And then during this decisioning time, I think it'd be really neat to see, with COVID hitting and everything else, what does church look like in a post-COVID world? Because it may look very different. It may look like there are much other satellite locations. I mean, I've got friends, as you probably do too, and colleagues are like, yeah, we'll probably in our jobs that we used to drive to Raleigh, we'll go 1 day a week. And now you've got corporates that are setting up satellite locations, like the thing going across the street. This can be that co-working space, et cetera. That's a perfect like satellite for Red Hat, et cetera. Maybe the churches do have smaller groups that are still meeting in houses plus a, church. And it'd just be really interesting to see. I think Holly Springs in particular, where we're located, we're going to see a ton more traffic. The growth from the past 10 years to 20 to 40,000 people, I would not be surprised if it tripled over the next 10 years. Just because of the mentality that COVID's driven. So what does a town that's going to experience that type of acceleration, what do people coming in want from a church? Like, what is church to them? So I think it might be a neat time to explore that out in the community. And we've got a bunch of cool groups that are going on. I mean, I know we've got the Waking Up White group this meeting. There's some talk about having part of the congregation also meet with the racial justice group this meeting, and there's the interfaith group. So it might be kind of neat. I don't know, just a thought. It might be kind of neat to see, what does the community want? Like, where can Kirk or Holly Springs be in that community as it evolves during COVID, and then make decisions off of that.
So Will, when I hear you say that second half of your description, I think either a church that's either under the umbrella of another church can do that, or an independent church can do that.
Yeah, I think so too.
And an independent church maybe might be able to do that more nimbly. I think we get the advantage because of our relationship with the Kirk. They really grant us a lot of autonomy, where they probably don't have to. They really do. Jody's a great pastor to work with, and so, but what if I'll answer the question from my perspective. So this is just me as a pastor speaking and working with the staff, which is a great staff to work with. But I'm curious, if we continue to be in relationship like we are now with the Kirk, when Jody retires, I'm curious as to what will happen with us. I don't think anything necessarily negative will happen, like we'll be, they'll stop the Kirk of Holly Springs. I don't think that'll happen. But I do wonder what the sort of autonomy will look like under new leadership. I don't think it'll necessarily change because, we govern by session, but the leadership of a senior minister is strategic and visionary and can have an impact on that. So I am curious. I'm not saying anything bad is going to happen, just saying I'm curious. I'm wondering about that.
Yeah, I think what's neat about that too is it sounds like the team collectively here as a congregation has done all the planning necessary, or most of it, to be able to make a quick independent split if we needed to. But in the meantime, like, I think there's opportunity to use the effectiveness of the relationship right now and then be able to make the decision when we all collectively think we need to be separate. I mean, how long is that process though? That's the big question. Like, how long is a chartering process if we're like, hey, today we need to do it?
Yeah.
I think
Mary, you can answer that.
I think we just need to be able to demonstrate that we can do the functions that are needed, particularly I mean, not only the church functions, religious functions, but the administrative and financial functions, I think is the big thing.
Yeah.
I will say though, just, and this is my own feeling, is that I think that the Kirk kind of expects us at this point to begin the conversations about how we can begin to take on some of these administrative functions. Their staff is, particularly their finance staff and folks like that, are taxed pretty good. And they, we're pretty big, asked of what they're doing for us. So Jeff, I don't know, you're on finance committee and things like that, but that's the impression I get from talking with staff and session meetings and things like that, that they would like us to begin to at least make inroads and beginning to address those things about how we can begin to pick up some things.
You talk about a timeline too, but what does a timeline look like for this? If it was decided to start in a month, let's say, how long would the timeline go before, this would reach a fruition?
Yeah. I sent out a document for folk to read. I probably should have sent it out again at the end of this week. But I kind of tried to write out based on another timeline of another church, which doesn't mean it would necessarily be exactly the same. But another church, their timeline based on the notes I was reading from these were CD&E notes. I think I was privileged to pull from that. It looked to me like it was about, Mary, was the Korean church in Greenville about a 9-month process?
Yes, at least a 9 month, probably longer than that.
About a 9
really.
month, maybe longer. So about a year.
About a year.
Yeah.
It's not anything that's,
Go ahead, Mary.
I'm sorry. I was just gonna say, it's not anything that has to be done tomorrow. It can be as
No.
long as we want it to be.
As a matter of fact, this is part of that process, is this conversation that we're having right now is because I think the purpose, part of that document was to create a sense of ownership in the process of becoming a charter congregation. And by ownership or buy-in, we mean, are you willing to sign your name to a charter and take on the responsibility of working with Presbytery and working with the Kirk of Kildare for all those things that we've been talking about in this conversation to occur. Will you take on the responsibility of mission and ministry in our location of Holly Springs, and be responsible for that?
I had a question.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'm curious because we're technically part of the 1001 worshiping communities, right? I'm curious if there's any sort of difference of transition coming from that context to a congregation versus a new church development. Like, is there bureaucratically, I guess, is there any more added time, or is it look any different?
I think the 1001 movement is really more of a network that we see in our denomination, and that Presbytery still hold the more specific work of the institutional pieces to this, chartering a church and things like that. So I think the movement is there. The 1001 movement is there in part for funding, the creative part of how do we create church in a new way. Thinking about going back to what I think Will was saying a few minutes ago about, responding in new ways that we can as church with COVID and all that. But in terms of the sort of taking it to the institutional level of becoming a congregation, which in the PCUSA, that's a specific word, as you know. We're and Jody reminds us of this, is that we are not a congregation. We use that term in a more, I think, generic sense, but it's the Presbytery that holds that work, if you will, of the institutional work. Did I answer that question for you, or does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I was basically just wondering if the process was any different for us since we're part of that network versus a new church development.
No, I think it's the same. It doesn't.
No, I mean, maybe it's even better because we have this support of being part of that network and to kind of take advantage of that being part of it.
It sounds to me like raising children. We basically, you raise them to a point of where you can let them go into the world. And this is a maturing of a church. Does that sound like a fair analogy?
I think it's an appropriate analogy. I've used it before, that, we're like children who are going off to college and into the world. And at some point, we're establishing our own bank accounts and our own sense of, it's our own sense of identity. Going back to the why question, and I'll be quiet if other folks want to speak to the why. The challenge will be is to not get so immersed in the steps and the how-tos, which I know we need to pay attention to, as we don't want to, the challenge is to not let that answer the why as to why we would do this in the first place. Because all of the how-to stuff is going to be solved. And we're going to have a lot of help solving it. And we're not going to be, again, we're not going to be set adrift. There are a lot of financial questions to answer, but you know what? There are churches that have been in existence for over 100 years that have much more difficult financial issues to deal with than we do. And they're closing, some of them, but some of them are finding creative ways to deal with that. But for me, the why has to do with that sense of identity, and being able to say, because it's a very specific terminology in our denomination, being able to say that we are a congregation, and brings a sense of, one, it does bring that sense of recognition by the institution in that process, but also the self-identity that we kind of answer to ourselves. You would answer to yourself as a congregation. Yeah, you're in greater mission with the Presbyterian Church USA, and you're a member of the New Hope Presbytery, but that autonomy really, to me, the autonomy sort of goes up, ramps up a good bit when you become a congregation, and that sense of self-identity really becomes very strong and powerful. Being a part of the Kirk is a wonderful gift, but being able to self-identify over and against the Kirk or any other congregation will be a gift too. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but.
Yeah, I was going to say, to respond, again, to the question of why, I think what you're saying, Jonathan, if I were to really think about that, that really is the why for me, is our identity. I know when I'm talking to different folks in our community, talking to my neighbors who go to some of those, huge churches in the area, when I try to explain to them who we are, I do feel kind of limited, because I'm having to explain, well, we're technically underneath the Kirk of Kildare, and, trying to explain our identity in relationship to another congregation. I mean, because I see us as a congregation, in quotes. But so for me, it's about being who we are in this community. This is our community. We don't worship in Cary. We worship here in Holly Springs or in our sanctuary. So for me, it really is about identity and who we are, and who do we tell the community that we are.
Jeff, I see you're off mute. Did you have something you were going to add a while ago?
Who?
You.
Oh, okay. No, I was trying to figure out how to get it off mute, and now that I'm off mute, I will say something. But the partnership, and my battery is pretty low, so I might cut out. But our partnership with the Kirk of Kildare has been one that has really been a good one to work with. They're hands off as much as possible, and has always let us do our own thing. And I think a lot of that goes to that we're self-supporting. They don't put any money per se into us. We're self-supporting, along with our pledges and what we get from the presbytery. And so in that aspect, we're sort of on our own. What we depend on the Kirk for is just the infrastructure to do payroll, to do bookkeeping, to do check writing, and we get a lot of benefits. Like Dave was saying, it's you know, we ride on their insurance. We you know, have those benefits. We don't pay per capita back to the presbytery out of our budget. So, and they allow us to do our own budget, and has never said no to us about anything, really. So, you know, I'm sort of torn. I'm torn between let's do it and let's not, because it's sort of a good situation. And really, the only push that I see coming toward us is from the presbytery. I think they're the ones that are saying, "Why don't you guys charter?" And you know, that's
So Jeff,
sort of the where we are.
So Jeff, one point I was making, and I think you can probably back this up, is that the time it takes for Ellen and others who do the financial stuff and all the is not insignificant on their part, and they're pretty taxed, and that, you know, probably it's not in their plan to continue to do this forever.
Yeah, but what they do, they do one extra payroll for Jonathan, and they're already doing 5 or 6, and one more is not that big of a deal to them.
And pay the bills.
And pay the bills, and we don't have that many. You know, we might write 75 checks a year.
Well,
So,
yeah.
you know, paying bills.
So plan
So it's not that big of a deal to them.
Yeah.
I mean, I've never heard Ellen say, "Oh Lord, you know, Kirk and Kildare, if I didn't have that, my job would be easy." She's never said that, and I've been in just about every finance meeting for the last 5 years, and had never heard that. I think the big push here is just from the presbytery. They want to see results.
Missionally speaking, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, presbytery is going to push for that. They want to develop new churches. Yeah, that's, you know, that makes sense to me. So I'm not surprised by that. I do want to be clear in saying that while the chartering process, which includes incorporating as a congregation and all those kinds of things, while it's related to our administrative and financial relationship with the Kirk, it is not necessarily so tied together that if we charter, we lose that relationship with the Kirk. And I think that's one of the promises that's been made, is that don't think that if you charter and you complete your charter and you're a PCUSA congregation, that all of a sudden you're out there on your own. I think that goes to the concerns about, you know, financial viability and the capability of taking on some of the particular tasks of a congregation ourselves. That process, while related, is I would submit as a separate process. You know, I think you can be we could be a charter congregation. Technically, I think we could be a charter congregation with all the responsibilities, including the obligation to pay the presbytery per capita. Because it's just paid for us right now. You know, that's the good thing. It wouldn't be very much anyway. But all of those things, you know, have all those responsibilities, but still have the assistance that we need to kind of be able to stand on our own 2 legs, would still be there from the Kirk. And I think for as long as is reasonably possible, I'll put it that way, as long as it's reasonably possible from the presbytery. There's some background here that Mary can probably speak to. One recent church development, maybe it's 5 or 10 years old now, really leaned on the presbytery for a long time and drained the presbytery of a lot of resources. And so the sort of sense of urgency to stay on task and to expedite certain things. I think that's part of the presbytery sort of why they're there. Mary, is that a fair?
Yeah, I think it is. I think the presbytery learned a lot about how to basically set parameters on what they'll fund because of a situation they had with a church where it just went on for years and years and years. I think I could probably safely say, being on the new church development committee, that if this congregation decided that we did not want to at least say we're moving forward on becoming independent, we probably would lose our safety net funding from the Church Development Evangelism Committee. And the reason why is they're focused on new church development. And if it looked like we weren't going to develop into a freestanding congregation, they would probably give the money to other groups that are moving in that direction, because money's so limited, because they would figure that we had the backing of the Kirk of Kilganaire to do that. So that's kind of the way I think it's going.
That is true. That is
I
true.
would just also throw in the comment, and I believe it's been made, but I think it's relevant here, that the Kirks had as part of their long-term plan, it included seating a congregation in an underserved area. So when we, as a independently worshiping group, approached the Kirk of Kildare, wanting to partner with them, and we specifically spoke with them about eventually becoming an independent congregation. The discussion at that point centered on the fact that the goals for the two groups were very similar. The worshiping group wanted to be more formalized, and the Kirk wanted to as part of their long-term strategy, wanted to have a congregation in a neighboring community that was, that they were in a position to support. So I think the relationship between this group and the Kirk always included an expectation and a hope, as well as a hope and a plan that we would become an independently chartered congregation at some point.
Is anybody here saying that we shouldn't become an independent chartered congregation, or we're just debating on timeline?
Let me, I'm going to briefly report on that, because we had a retreat back in November, long ago, back in November. And I realized that we might have different changes of mind, but from that point, we did an exercise within the room of folks gathered, and it was maybe 30 or 40 so folk at this. After worship, we had a Thanksgiving lunch, and then did a retreat on this. And one of the exercises was to form a spectrum in the room of to charter or not to charter. And so no one was on the far end of not chartering. Nearly everybody was on the end of chartering, and a few were a little bit towards the middle on the chartering end. But everybody, it seemed, well, I say everybody, a lot of questions seem to be generated over what does it look like. So a lot of question on the how. What does it look like? Can we do it? What are the triggers for becoming chartered? Which I think it's all contextual. A lot of it's contextual. So, in that sense, from that moment in time, Will, I would say that everybody in that room at that time was saying we support chartering. But that there were a lot of questions on, I really think the questions had to do with how we stand alone and what the transition from the Kirk's oversight of things to our oversight, what that looks like. I really felt like that's where the anxiety was on that issue. Really had less to do with the steps of chartering. I mean, there are a few questions over incorporation and stuff like that, but it really had more to do with, you know, taking on the institutional tasks that a church has to take on. But, you know, who's going to do payroll? Who's going to pay the board pensions? Who's, and bless Jeff Tucker, who does a lot of great work for us as our treasurer. I'm like, yeah, he's hearing all this and going, I can't do this by myself. And he, you know, why he shouldn't. You know, I wonder that, I feel that for him, and that's why we're forming a transitional team around that work. You know, to gather people who are, we hope and feel are admin, finance type people. And so I don't know if I don't mean to speak out of turn, but any other comments or questions? This is good conversation. This is exactly as I hoped it would go for this kind of forum. It's kind of hard to do it, you know, on Zoom, but this is the kind of conversation that we've generated that's helpful, and the leadership team needs to be aware of. So leadership team members take note. Yeah. Anything else if folks want to? Ed, go ahead.
Lane actually answered the question I was going to when Dave came back. He dropped out and came back, and that's where I was going with that timeline. Why we are where we are, and which the Presbytery is looking for a presence in the Western Wake. So that conversation came back, and we ended up focusing on Holly Springs because, like you said, Will, that the growth is just phenomenal on that end of the county. It's exploding. You go west of NC 55, and it's unbelievable the communities that have sprung up out there. It's just all the way to the rest of Wake and on into the neighboring counties. So that's why we're in this area. Now, our name could change. We could not be called, we may not be called, if we did charter, the Kirk of Holly Springs. It may be something that was for further west because we don't know where we're going to end up being located. But for now, that's what it is. But that ties in exactly what you're talking about, Will, about, there's room for growth. The question is now is, what is it going to look like? You were also talking about that a little bit. With COVID, we're starting to look at the Zoom and what does that mean? We just saw in this service today, there was at least one person there that was from a previous church that we came from. I wish they had stuck around for the, for the get together afterwards. But there's nothing that says we might not have somebody that shows up from California. I doubt it, but you never know. But that's kind of, what do we do going forward? What's the church going to look like? That's a valid question that you brought up. And that's to be taken into consideration for what kind of moves we make down the road.
Yeah. And established churches are going through that conversation too, Ed. The ones that want to survive, they're having that conversation too. So it's not just new churches. And I want to be transparent about what I feel my role is. My designation was changed a few years ago to organizing pastor, and in the Presbyterian Church that has a very that has a lot of historic meaning and sort of baggage, if you will, with it. And that baggage is that we're here to create a new congregation in the Presbyterian Church USA. I'll be upfront in saying that's my goal, is that we become chartered and independent. And I mean, that's the work that I feel I've been called to do. But having said that, this is your path. This is your journey. And while I might advocate for, moving along the line of chartering and all that, at the end of the day, it's still your journey. And like I said, only the group of people of that community can decide whether or not they want to become a congregation and why. I will try to speak to the thing about how I think in our particular situation, chartering is not necessarily tied in a causal way to our relationship with the Kirk. Does that make sense? I think we could charter and still be related to the Kirk in the way that we're currently related to them. If we need that, I think that's not to say we shouldn't work towards weaning off of them, but I think that doesn't have to change. If we chartered tomorrow, if we went to the next presbytery meeting and said, we petitioned, we the undersigned, filled out that organizing covenant, I don't think that would sever the relationship with the Kirk. They've as much said it won't. They know this is a gradual process as far as the transitional pieces. So just want to assure you of that, but also to just say thank you for the conversation. This is good conversation, and I'll try to shut up now.
I like that too, because it sounds like we got options there. So I guess I'm thinking about it from an entrepreneur's mindset here.
I hear you.
We got COVID, right? So we got the congregation we have now. Is it, and the identity thing that Elizabeth mentioned that we were all talking about, the identity of who is Kirk of Holly Springs? Is it better to charter now and come out, hey, we're stepping it out there? Or is it better to work towards chartering, going ahead and reallocating like expenses to help pay for the increase in costs that our congregation takes on, working towards that path of charter in X months, but along the way be building a lot of other traction in how we're a congregation in Holly Springs in a post-COVID world, and have the community be invited into that vision of it's the community beyond just this room that's launching, here's Kirk of Holly Springs. And that's like how it's launched. So I guess we could do it either way, it sounds like. But which one provides more impact into the community and representation for who we would be as a church, a Christian church? And I don't have a good answer either way, but it sounds like we got past either way. We just have to whiteboard them out and work towards them. And it sounds like all the legwork's it's starting to be put in place. It's just a matter of, okay, well, now we need to shift accounting or contribute some to accounting, if it's on the Kirk, because they're continuing to take on more, or we could become a chartered congregation now and we take on that expense, but Kirk's still helping us, right? I mean, that's essentially the two paths I'm hearing emerge. So I'd just be curious which path people would rather, which one will be more effective and which one's more representation of like our culture, of our identity. But I'm all for chartering. I just don't know the timeline and which way we want to come out identity and culture and values wise.
And I think so that's going to require a conversation with the Kirk also, and see, what they're continuing to be willing to do and all that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this transitional team that we've started trying to form, the conversation that we have with, I imagine the conversation is with Jody and if not some form of representation from the session, certainly folks from certain teams like certainly the finance team of the Kirk, which would include Judy Nagy or at least Ellen Chambers, what that, sort of whiteboarding, if you will, there, dry erase boarding, those steps, what they look like, when do we start paying our own insurance? When do we start paying the presbytery per capita? How do we build that into our budget? We're formulating the 2021 budget. Should we be factoring those costs into our budget for this new budget cycle? That would be a question. So that's a good question, Will, is, how do we take all this on?
Yeah, and I think it sounds like we may have some people on the team, part of the transition team, that would be taking care of that, while there's another team that's working in parallel to say, okay, Holly Springs is growing. What would our congregation look like in the midst of Holly Springs, 6 months from now, 1 year from now?
Yeah.
And what is it that because if that doesn't happen, so theoretically, I just play devil's advocate, we charter tomorrow. And we go out there a year from now, we're still the same size, even in a post-COVID world. Obviously, as a congregation, we've chartered, but we've just become one of those congregations that's going to die because we haven't done anything. The flip side of that is we don't charter. We're still attached to a Kirk and we still don't grow. We're still in the same situation. So I think a lot of the emphasis on the administrative is we got some really good talent here.
Yeah.
They can work through the technicalities to make sure the presbytery realizes we want to charter. Mm-hmm. But we've also got some really good talent here that's focused on the programs, continues to focus on the programs. And we got this huge mission before us. And how is Jesus represented in Holly Springs? especially in a COVID world, because I don't know the answer to that. I'm very curious what the answer to that is and what the convergence is and what the society we live in COVID, everything else. It's daunting and scary to me.
Yeah.
So that's the piece I'm worried about.
Yeah. And the interesting piece too, Will, is that, Jody has said to me is that, what's the worst that can happen if you did charter and you failed? We'd still have a church home that we could go to. I mean, it would just mean that it just didn't work out.
That's right.
And yeah, maybe there's a stigma attached to that. But as far as the lives of people being cared for in a pastoral sense and mission still being able to take place in some form in the community, that can still take place. I think his point was that, taking that, I think we can look at it from a faith perspective of, sometimes that first step of faith has to be taken, not being able to see the full stairwell, the staircase. That's a Martin Luther King Jr. thing, I think, that I'm stealing. But sometimes you just take the step, believing that it's, that the stairwell is there, that the process is going to engage.
So when's the transition committee meeting, or is that something to be formed?
It's still being formed, I think.
Cool.
Soon, I hope.
In any endeavor, there's always a risk, but unless you take the risk, there is no growth. So, the way you look at it is this the proper decision right now? Yeah, it could be.
Yeah, and I think in either case, to that point, Bruce, and what I've heard everybody else here say is we want a charter. We need that transition committee so we know, like, what's the timeline? Because Jonathan, like you said, it could be 9 months, but it could be quicker. It sounds like most of this is really on us. So it'd be cool to have a definition of, oh, here's the timeline, here's the cost. We work towards that, great.
Yeah, and keep in mind that we could be dealing with 2 timelines, because we could feasibly charter and still have a timeline that weans us off the administration of the Kirk. That could be 2 different timelines that are just simultaneous with each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we're saying the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Sorry. I'm doing slightly. I will. Sorry.
No, we're saying it in different ways.
Gotcha.
Some of the things what Jonathan was talking about, Will, has actually been talked about with the Kirk, okay, like administrative things, doing the, continuing to do the finances. That might come out of our budget. We end up paying them as a charter, but they would do that for us, a possibility, if we want to go down that road.
Yeah, and like excluding all of that, because it sounds like this conversation would happen. Jonathan, you said, hey, if we chartered tomorrow, like in my head, I think the missing piece for me is like, do we just have to sign into it? That's it. And then we have a ceremony and that's it? Or is there like some other technicality that's like an impediment to doing it? That's why I don't know.
Yeah. I know. Well, it's really, to apply for a charter really is that simple in the Presbyterian Church.
Oh, sweet.
But it's all the other work that goes with it that the presbytery and partner churches require. That's, the devil's in the details.
Yep.
But the actual organizing covenant is a simple matter of signing the covenant and submitting it to President. Now, because of it being all the other pieces, we make it a more process oriented, and we engage in it as a process. But yeah, the act of chartering itself, as I read the Book of Order, is a pretty simple thing, but it's all the other pieces that go with it that you have to pay attention to. So.
Sweet. Well, I look forward to voting on it. My vote is always a yes in this regard, like Bruce said too, and like other people said, is no risk, no reward, but it'd also be cool to come out with a cool bang as that chartering to celebrate it. It's like, yeah, we're doing this, but we've also got this new thing going on that's really cool that nobody else is really working on, because we live in a new world and we're going into it. I think that draws people in. And then Jonathan, you could do like like the pastor riff off with like 5 other pastors in the area, like on that initial day, or what? however.
I think chartering has the potential also to be a motivational issue. Could be motivational for us to do all those things we've talked about.
Yeah.
Looking outside the box, doing all sorts
Absolutely.
of creative things.
Mhm.
I think the need is here. The question is, what is it and how do we get it? And all these things.
Devil's in the details.
It's exploding.
Yeah, you're right. Well, again, thank you for the conversation. I appreciate my sort of very general slide presentation. I really intended it to generate the conversation that we've had today. I think it's fair to say that we want to continue to have these opportunities to discuss. I mean, there are some people who are not present with us to be a part of this conversation. And I think, part of the sort of ownership and buy-in that as many people as possible can have the opportunity to ask and wonder and participate in the conversation, because at some point you will be asked to sign your name to a covenant and to undertake that work. And so, when you put your name to something, I figure you want to know as much about it as possible. So having that opportunity to engage in this conversation. So there'll be other opportunities. And we might find ourselves repeating some of this or finding nuance within some of this comments we've made today. So, and we may be further along on some of the work and we can report back on that. So I'm not sure when the next conversation, this forum will take place. But we'll see. We're not going to drag this out. We're going to expedite whatever decision is going to be made. It's going to be expedited in a way that we don't feel like we're dragging on. So,
Jonathan, could you resend the information, the chartering information?
The 7-page document, Mary. Yeah, absolutely. I'll send that out in the group again. If I can get to it during the week, that'd be great. I might be able to get to it today. But yeah, I'll be happy to do that. Yeah. It's a 7-page document that sort of outlines a lot, provides information from the presbytery, shows the outline of a timeline that they used with a church in Eastern North Carolina. And so I just generalized that timeline. And then there are a few other pieces that they highlight. So it just gets you thinking and wondering about the process. So I'll send that out again. All right, I'm gonna read Will's chat. Okay. Yeah.
Venture building world, we have something called fail fast, meaning remove all the impediments to growing quickly. So it sounds like we're kind of in that phase.
Yeah. All right. Well, I thank you for your time, folks. If there aren't any other questions, I don't know if anybody wants to remain for a little bit of fellowship or not. I'm willing. I've set this up to end at around 12:30, so I'm not sure. I think we're moving in on that time, but I appreciate y'all remaining after and hanging in there.
Thank you.
Well,
Yeah, thank you, Mary, for input and everybody else.
Appreciate the work that's been done toward this.
Thank you. Thanks to all y'all were at the very beginning.
Everybody have a great afternoon. Yowzers.
Thank you.
You too.
Thank you, Will. I'm the host now.
bye.